Good evening and welcome. So nice to see so many of you out tonight. My name is Katie Del May, and I am the curator who has had the pleasure of overseeing the first presentation of Dorothea Lange, Politics of Seeing, which, as you know, will be on view in our upper level galleries until May 27th. Thank you again for joining us tonight for our lecture, Lange, Artist or Activist, that is presented in conjunction with the opening of this notable exhibition. For in addition to relating to issues that are really relevant today, issues like the persistence of poverty, environmental degradation, the treatment of immigrants, the role of the government in financial aid, and the role of images in shaping public opinion, this exhibition is important because it provides a broad examination of one of the most important social documentary photographers of the 20th century, of history, really. And yet she's an artist who's typically identified with just a single image. Of course, Migrant Mother and the other 6 works that were part of that shoot is featured in the show, but it is shown within the context of her wider career, from the earliest days as a portrait photographer in San Francisco to her documentation of everyday life in post-war California. All of the works come to us from the Oakland Museum of California, to which Lange and her husband, Paul Taylor, gave her personal archive after her death in 1965. And the exhibition was curated by Drew Heath Johnson, who has overseen this amazing archive there for almost 30 years. In November, it'll be 30 years, right? During that time, he has come to know intimately both the material and, from what I've learned during his visit here in Nashville, the woman who made the images. And we are really delighted to have Drew here to share that insight with us this evening. Johnson's title is Curator of Photography and Visual Culture at the Oakland Museum, and he has organized many exhibitions since he began working there in 1989. His duties also, of course, include the guardianship and sharing of Lange's entire personal archive, a collection with more than 6,000 vintage prints and 40,000 negatives, along with the artist's personal correspondence, field notes, proof sheets, and working documents. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors tonight. The exhibition is supported in part by the Oakland Museum Women's Board, the Henry Luce Foundation, the Susie Tompkins Buell Fund, Anne Hatch and Paul Disco, the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation, and Peter Rossi, Stifel, Nicholas and Company. The presentation here in Nashville is supported by Ameriprise Financial, who are silver sponsors of the exhibition. And as always, we would like to thank the Metro Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts for their continuing operating support. Please join me in welcoming to the stage now, Drew Johnson.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks to you all for coming out. Thanks to the First Museum, Susan Edwards, and Megan Rust for inviting me, and it's a beautiful installation. I'm very, very excited and very proud to have the exhibition here in Nashville. A few months ago, when Katie asked me for a title for tonight's talk, I sort of threw out, how about artist or activist? And I haven't exactly come to regret the decision, but I think I didn't realize perhaps what a challenging question that is to answer. Both are terms that Lange herself rejected repeatedly a number of times over the years. Yes, she was very reluctant to call herself an artist, believe it or not. So I thought it would be interesting and instructive to sort of walk through her beginnings, provide examples from her career that might lean a little bit more to one side or the other of the artist or the activist, and try to determine whether that's even, it's frankly not a question that I have spent a lot of time considering, interestingly enough, which may seem odd considering that the title of the exhibition is Politics of Seeing, and that it's organized around the idea of using photography as a persuasive tool, a tool to inspire people to recognize social injustice, to recognize suffering, and to hopefully maybe even be inspired to do something about it. But as I say, her statements on the matter were very few to begin with, and also quite often contradictory. So we'll start a little bit with her background, as we do in the exhibition. We thought this was an important thing to do because I think more than some artists' backgrounds and career, the early life provides a real clue, I think, to what happened to her art and what she did later on. I think the emotional power of her work stems from her personal sense of empathy, which is a quality that she acquired during a very difficult childhood. As you can see from the quote there, I had in my early years, before I was fully grown, a variety of experiences that a child shouldn't really meet alone. Now I know how much that has given me. And the first thing she's referring to there, she was born in Hoboken, New Jersey, by the way, in 1895, into a very comfortable middle-class household. But at the age of 7, she was stricken with polio, and something there was really almost epidemic status in those days. And she emerged from it being able to walk, but with a withered leg and a very pronounced limp that stayed with her the rest of her life. And she makes frequent remarks. I'm going to be quoting from her quite a bit. She makes quite a few remarks to what she calls the walking wounded, people that are out there and they're functioning, but they're carrying some burden. And I think she often thought that applied to herself, or at least that she had an ability to connect to people with that. You see a little picture of little Dorothea as a little girl with her brother, and as a young woman on the right. And the picture on the lower left is a photograph that she took. It's actually from an entire 36 exposure roll of 35 millimeter film that she sat down one day in the 1950s and shot of the foot, as she called it. It doesn't actually look that bad, but it did have an effect, and she was fascinated by it, and she just sat there on the couch shooting picture after picture after picture of her polio-stricken leg. I mentioned I'm going to be quoting from her quite a bit. Yeah, she was a very, very eloquent person in writing as much as with a camera. The other hard thing that happened just a few years after the polio was that her father abandoned the family, picked up and left. She had actually been born Dorothea Nutzhorn, but when the father left and took in his income with him, she and her mother resorted to her mother's maiden name, Lange, and they moved to much poorer quarters in New York City, and her life changed appreciably, as you can imagine. She talked about polio, saying, "I think it was perhaps the most important thing that happened to me, informed me, guided me, instructed me, helped me, and humiliated me. All those things at once." Sorry to keep going back and forth there, I apologize. But this move to New York was really interesting because it really stimulated her visual sense, a desire to see. That's the seeing part of the title of the exhibition. Her grandmother once said, that girl has line. She has a sense of line and of composition that she could tell even from drawings that she made. And she said, "On the Bowery, I knew how to step over drunken men." This is the change of life. "I had to do it, I knew how to keep an expression of face that would draw no attention so no one would look at me. I have used that my whole life in photographing." Then one day, as a young woman, she announced to her mother that she wanted to become a photographer. We're not exactly sure where this came from, but she said, "I want to be a photographer." And my mother said, "You have to have something to fall back on." Well, I didn't want to have anything to fall back on. I knew it was dangerous to have something to fall back on. In the meantime, she was also experiencing the cultural life of New York City. She discovered at some point Isadora Duncan, who you see on the left. She called that an experience that affected me throughout my life. I saw her every performance that I could possibly find a way to, and I had never been taken into the upper reaches of human existence before then. I still live with that, not as a theatrical performance, but as an extension of human possibility. So it sort of awakened her sense of art. She gave great credit to Isadora Duncan for that. The person on the right is Arnold Kenty, a very well-known photographer, best known actually for his photographs taken in San Francisco Chinatown before the earthquake of 1906 and then the destruction from the earthquake and fire of 1906. But at this time, he had a very successful portrait studio gallery in New York City, and he took Lange on as a sort of an apprentice. And she said of him, Arnold Kenty was an unconscionable old goat in that he seduced everyone who came into the place. Yes, he was a real roue, but what I found out when I worked for him was that this man was very properly a photographer of women because he really loved them. I found out something there, that you can photograph what you are really involved with. He wasn't at all a vulgar man. He loved women, he understood them. He could make the plainest woman an illuminated woman. I watched him do it right and left, and they all fell for it. She also took a photography class from Clarence White, a very well-known pictorials photographer in New York, and in her early 20s, she and her best friend, a young woman named Franzi, decided that they were going to take a trip around the world. It was time to leave home, and they headed west across the United States, got as far as San Francisco, where their intention was to catch a boat and really circumnavigate the world when they had all of their money still at the YWCA. And she had to, of course, earn some money, so she took a job working at a photo finishing counter at a drugstore in San Francisco. Where one day, Imogen Cunningham, as the photographer Imogen Cunningham, and her husband, Roy Partridge, who was an etcher, taught at Mills College in Oakland, walked into the drugstore, struck up a conversation that led to a friendship. I became a part of the photographic community, and in remarkably short order, by 1919, she'd arrived only in 1918, she had secured funding, seemingly through charm alone, to open her own studio portrait gallery. And, oh, sorry, let me go back a little bit. Sorry for the back and forth. You see there some examples of her work. Again, like her early life, this is an important thing to look at because this is where she honed her craft. She learned how to work with the technical aspects of photography, really get in there, and more importantly, she learned to work with people individually, collaborating with them on presenting themselves in the best possible light or in a way that revealed their personality in some way. This is something that she, applied to her documentary photography as well. As she said, pardon me, I found myself in San Francisco in the portrait business. I had the cream of the trade. I was the person to whom you went if you could afford it. It wasn't exactly a society trade. It was more of the bohemian sort of artistic community of San Francisco and the wealthy philanthropic community of San Francisco, the patrons of the arts, so forth. And her studio became a real hangout for the artistic crowd. She would be down in the darkroom working away, and a party would be going on upstairs in her reception room filled with artists. And one day she was down there. Real quickly, she said, I had an uncertain technique, but an outlook. I was pretty sure that I was working in a direction. I had launched myself, educated myself in a scrappy, choppy, unorthodox way, but I don't know a better way, if you could go through it, than that. So this is a point at which to stop to consider artist. Did she consider herself an artist? No, she didn't, as a matter of fact. She said, it never occurred to me. People like Imogen Cunningham, whom I knew very well by that time, worked for name and prestige and art and sent to exhibits. But I was a tradesman, at least I so regarded myself. I wasn't trying to be a great photographer. I never have. This is years later, by the way, in a oral history interview. I was a photographer and I did everything that I could to make it as good as I could. And good meant to me being useful, filling a need, really pleasing the people for whom I was working. By that I don't mean pandering to their vanity, but sincerely trying to give them what they wanted, which meant then as now that my personal interpretation was second to the need of the other fellow. Again, something that I think she carried through to her documentary work. So one day she's down in the darkroom working and the party's going on upstairs and she hears clump, 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 loud, heavy boots on the ceiling ahead of her, above her, and she asked her assistant, who was that person clumping around upstairs? Said, oh, that's Maynard Dixon. He's a painter. He thinks he's a cowboy. And there he is with one of his paintings. On the fans of Western American art will be very familiar with Maynard Dixon. A really important painter of scenes mostly in the Southwest. He also did a lot of illustration. of cowboy scenes and things. He dressed as a cowboy, as you could hear by the cowboy boots, even though that was not really his background. Portraits of Native Americans, scenes of the desert, and so on. They were introduced, romance blossomed, and they were soon married with 2 children. And there they are, Dorothea, about that time, in the 1920s, on the left, Maynard on the right. Both the portraits of Maynard, by the way, are portraits by Lange, and their 2 children, Dan and John. She said, "I always felt that as his wife, I really failed him because I never really pushed hard enough so that he would work with his life's blood. He could have been a greater man. He had it in him. I wasn't really involved in the vitals of the man, not the vitals. I continued to reserve a small portion of my life, and that was my photographic area." So she sort of sublimated her art and her business, although she was in some ways supporting him, to his art. She would accompany him on long extended trips to the Southwest where she would look after the children while he would be out in the desert. She said, "We went into a country which was endless and timeless and way out and off from the pressures that I thought were part of life. The earth and the heavens," there's some right now, sorry about that. "The earth and the heavens, even the change of seasons, I'd never really experienced until that time. Then I became aware." So it's interesting, sort of tentative pushes towards a documentary style there, but not really formed. The Depression woke me up. Of course, in the early 1930s, America was hit by a devastating economic impression, and it certainly hit San Francisco in a hard way as well. They were financially affected. Her business was affected, although not in a dire way. She said that her studio was one flight up, and one day she was in her studio, business was down, there was nothing particular to do. She looked out the window. She saw a man who was obviously unemployed in ragged clothes came to the street corner below her window and not know which way to turn, on which street to go down, and then slowly wander off. She said, "By this time, the discrepancy between what I was working on in the studio and what was going on in the street was more than I could assimilate. I knew that if my interests in people were valid, I would not be doing only what was in those printing frames." Interest in people, that is the through story. The studio room was one flight up, and I looked down as long as I could, and then one day I said to myself, I'd better make this happen, and that started me. She grabbed her camera, she headed out into the street, and on her very first trip into the street, she produced the photograph on the left, which is probably her second most famous image after Migrant Mother. It's called White Angel Breadline. She ended up just wandering. She said, "I went out in a blind staggers with no fixed purpose, just wandering, taking it all in like she had in the Bowery in New York." And she ended up at this breadline or soup kitchen, which was run by a rich woman known as the White Angel. She took this photograph, as I say, on her very first trip into the street, and at that point, figuratively, never returned to the studio again. I mean, she operated her business for about a year longer. She said, "I put this photograph on the wall of my studio, and customers would come in and just glance at it. The only comment I ever got was, 'What are you going to do with this kind of thing? What do you want to do this for? What do you want to do this for?' That was a question I couldn't answer. I didn't know. But I knew that my picture was on my wall, and I knew that it was worth doing." Just going back really quickly to this photograph right here, to give a really good example, she commented on this image in particular. "5 years earlier, I would have thought it enough to take a picture of a man, no more. But now I wanted to take a picture of a man as he stood in his world. In this case, a man with his head down, with his back against the wall, with his livelihood like the wheelbarrow overturned." So when you talk about San Francisco in 1933 and 1934, if ever there was a time when Lange could have felt pressured to identify specifically as an activist, to join a political movement, that would have been it. It's fascinating. There was the West Coast General Strike was centered in San Francisco. They shut the entire city down, starting with the longshoremen and the dock workers. There was Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo were visiting and spent time with Lange. In fact, Lange referred what would become Frida Kahlo's doctor, most important doctor. They sort of bonded over their disabilities. And of course, Rivera being a prominent member of the Communist Party, There was the first federal arts project program was being painted at Coit Tower. If any of you have been to San Francisco, Coit Tower is this monument, the interior of which is painted with these incredible, it was before the WPA, so you can't call it WPA murals, but they're murals of workers in San Francisco. There were a group of artists that did it, many, if not most of whom, were actually members of the Communist Party. Dorothea Lange was approached many times to join the Communist Party. She always refused them. She was not the kind of person, not necessarily because she disagreed with many of their goals, but because she was just simply not the kind of person who joined political parties and identified in that way as an activist. You see, one of the problems right there of answering that question is that she really took her own path in trying to deal with these social issues. These photographs right here are taken at another big event that happened in San Francisco in 1934. It's a big May Day rally in Civic Center right in front of the San Francisco City Hall that she said, I set myself the task to go photograph this event. She knew it was coming up. And she said, I'm going to go down there and grab a hunk of lightning, see if I can grab a hunk of lightning, which is the title of the film that is excerpted in the exhibition right now, and a copy of which you can buy in the store here if you'd like. This is an interesting photograph too, the one on the left. By the way, the woman's holding a Communist Party newspaper there, listening to the speaker. And it was this work, it was her early San Francisco work, see if there's one more of this, no, that really was responsible for her first exhibition and her first publication. And that the exhibition was in Oakland at the old F-64 gallery. Group F-64 was a group of Northern California photographers that included Ansel Adams and Edward Weston and Imogen Cunningham and Willard Van Dyke and others. Went on to great fame later on, but they had, their old gallery was taken over by Willard Van Dyke as a permanent photography gallery space, and he gave Willard did her first exhibition there, which was this street photography, even it's a little hard for us to grasp how unusual this type of photography was at the time, but the show was visited by a social scientist from the University of California at Berkeley named Paul S. Taylor. He was an expert in migratory farm labor, and by this time, California was dealing with the incredible influx of migrants, universally referred to as refugees, by the way, at the time, from Oklahoma and Arkansas and the Midwest and the South, coming into California looking for very impermanent farm work and what to do about the crisis. It was recognized as a crisis, was put forth as an invasion of our borders by refugees who were dishonest and criminal, and so he was looking for ways to help them and mainly to record. As I say, he was a social scientist, a sociologist, and he knew that words alone could not properly convey the experience of these people in the crisis. And so he experimented with photography unsuccessfully. And when he saw Lange's work, he first asked if he could publish some of her photographs in a magazine called Survey Graphic. And the ones you see right here ended up in the magazine. And Dorothea was very cross to find out that on the photograph on the left, the magazine put the slogan, he said, underneath my photograph, they put the slogan, "Workers of the world unite," which was no favor to me, but that's what they did. Made me a communist right away quick. So Paul and Dorothea hit it off very strongly. In fact, romance blossomed. It seems to have been a case of love at first sight, pretty much. He was married with children, she was married with children. Double divorce resulted, and they began a partnership that lasted the rest of her life. That's them in 1935 on the road in the field, and them on the right at Paul's 62nd birthday in, I think it was in the early 60s. So they began this journey photographing the migrants, the refugees coming into California, fleeing the Dust Bowl, looking for work, looking for a better life in California. You know, the story that John Steinbeck tells in The Grapes of Wrath. And she said Driving for the next 300 or 400 miles on her very first trip, I saw these people, and I couldn't wait. I photographed it. Luckily, my eyes were open to it. She also talks about becoming a real social observer, and Paul taught her the importance of taking very careful notes about what she was photographing, recording the circumstances, and she took it beyond that, even not only the circumstances, but the verbatim words that the people spoke. So she documented the camps, the people traveling on the road, and with Paul, she put together a couple of reports to the California State Resettlement Administration. These reports that went to the state government to provide evidence for, hopefully for policies that would aid or help the legislation make policies to aid the migrants, agricultural laborers of California Migrant Camp Project. They're extremely low-tech, handmade books, spiral-bound notebooks with pasted-in photographs, mostly with handwritten captions. And eventually these photographs one of these albums at least made their way to Washington, D.C., where a man named Roy Stryker and Rexford Tugwell were organizing what would become the Farm Security Administration, a division of the WPA, Works Progress Administration, New Deal agency, one of the alphabet soup agencies. This one was specifically charged with studying and addressing and hopefully relieving the migrant crisis that was happening across the country. I was somewhat surprised to discover, working on the exhibition, that I knew Lange was one of this group. Eventually, Roy Stryker hired a group of 7 or 8 photographers to go out, including Arthur Rothstein and Ben Shahn and Gordon Parks and people like that, sent them out across the country to record what was happening in the country as part of the historical division, which I think was a little disingenuous. It was partly to sort of fool Congress and conservatives in Congress that were, ever sensitive to what they saw as propaganda, trying to help people that may not deserve being helped. So they said, well, they're just documenting for history what's going on here. But when Roy Stryker saw the reports that Lange and Taylor did, as Ben Shahn said, this was a revelation what this woman was doing. Roy's whole direction changed. So in some ways, Lange is partly responsible for this, creating this incredible body of work of a group of photographers who really have produced have left us with a way to visualize the Dust Bowl years. If it weren't for this group of photographers, I think we would think of that entire era in a completely different way. A few more. This is a page from one of the government reports, and you can see that's Dorothea's very distinctive handwriting, and it's a quote from the man. It says, "How can we go when we ain't got no place to go to? Sacramento Shantytown, May 1935. So you can see the care that she took recording. As she said, I never steal a photograph, never. All photographs are made in collaboration as part of their thinking as well as mine. And of course, this is something that really separates her from a lot of documentary photographers. I've heard the term poverty porn, which is basically, just sort of an unsubtle way of photography. A photograph can just thrust something unpleasant in your face with the intent of manipulating her. That was not the way she worked. And she was also this question of collaboration, of really working with people. She often spent 20, 30 minutes talking with someone, telling them she was from the government, she was there to help, that asking how many children they have, talking about her children, before she even took her camera out. And by that time, the people were relaxed enough to let her photograph and work with her to be photographed. She said, often it's just sticking around, not swooping in and out in a cloud of dust, sitting down on the ground with people, letting the children look at your camera with their dirty, grimy little hands, because you know that if you behave in a generous manner, you're very apt to receive it. So she continued on this road, and of course, along the way produced, we're going to be talking more about Migrant Mother soon. A couple of instances in the exhibition when you see how we raise the issue of how a photograph can be made more or less emotionally involving or powerful or persuasive through uses of photographic techniques like cropping. She was extremely experimental with cropping Example right here, she printed this negative both ways. She would often print a negative, crop a negative 4 or 5 different ways. She was eventually sent to the Deep South. She was in the Midwest and in Texas, the Pacific Northwest, the farms, the FSA sent her all over the country. Her work in the Deep South is particularly interesting because I think it touches on a little bit on the question of her intention and as manifested in basically not following orders, in being told to do something but then doing what she thought was important rather than what she was told. And in the Deep South, she was fascinated by what was a completely different agricultural labor system instead of this seasonal migrant labor that they had in California, where you'd come in when the crops needed to be picked, and then you're out of luck, you're out of work for the rest of the year, basically. This was a place with tenant farms and sharecropping and families really tied to the land and in debt to the landlord, and if you were black, in a system that really was not that much different from slavery. So she had instructions from Roy Stryker to concentrate primarily on white farmers, because the thought being that not that the story wasn't important, he'd say, but because that's how we're going to build support for the agency, and it's going to be easier to do it that way. Well, of course, she ignored those instructions and produced like the pair of photographs right here, and the one on the left is called White Southerner, the one on the right is called Ex-Slave with a Long Memory. She photographed segregated lunch counters. She's shooting from the white half of the segregated lunch counter across to the African American section. A lot of the photographs have really interesting comments on race relations. This is an example of that, and also an example of how she basically had lost control of her photographs when you worked for a government agency in those days especially. She'd sent them off, and their idea was to get them published anywhere and everywhere, get them out there so that people could see them. And in this case, the fascinating image of what's basically an overseer, a white overseer, with his laborers working for him here on the left. And when Archibald MacLeish came to write a book called Land of the Free, which is a sort of reflection on America during the Depression that's extolling the best qualities of America and why we're going to survive this, he cropped the guys on the left completely out and sort of transformed the photograph from a study of racial power dynamics to a picture of a strong, powerful white yeoman farmer, salt-of-the-earth American farmer. Illustrates the power of cropping we were talking about before. And of course, we had to talk about Migrant Mother, which is certainly a masterpiece and certainly something that everybody's familiar with, perhaps overly familiar, you might say. The fascinating thing about this photograph is that it very quickly became her most famous photograph. As you see, the historian Sally Stein called it the most widely reproduced photograph in the entire history of photographic image making. I'm not sure if that's true, but it sounds possible. Some things you do get a life of their own. And then Florence Tompson, I didn't get anything out of it. I wish she hadn't have taken my picture. Florence Tompson is the Migrant Mother herself, and harbored a great deal of resentment, especially when especially when the photograph took on such a life of its own. She was annoyed by it, Lange was annoyed by it, and it's just a few examples of how it's become such an icon. It's been postage stamps, I love the grapes of Wrath of Khan there. As you see, it was transformed as the cover of the Black Panther newsletter from Oakland up there. Down and out in Discount America, she's wearing a Walmart badge. So it's just very, very flexible for all kinds of purposes like that, probably a key to its importance and success. And Florence Tompson actually lived until about 1978, I think it was, and there she is with the children in the photograph, and became widely known. And when it was heard that she had cancer and who it was, thousands of dollars of donations poured in to help her and her family. They were already, they hadn't been destitute for a great many years, but it certainly helped. And the family sort of came around eventually saying that, well, maybe Mama's picture did some good. Another important thing to remember about the Migrant Mother is that it's a case where she did not follow her usual careful time to take the photograph. She was heading home after a long trip on the road, just a few hours from Berkeley, saw a sign that said Pea Pickers Camp. It was cold and rainy, had a long argument with herself for about 20 miles before turning the car around and going back. Took this series of 7 photographs approaching the Migrant Mother and Florence Tompson and her family, and turned around and left. Didn't record her name, didn't record her information accurately. So it's a fascinating and ironic case of where, that it should become her most famous image by quite a bit, wide margin. Now, the second big section of her body of work that we show in the exhibition is World War II at Home, Capturing Unity and Exposing Injustice. Two projects that really, the two most important projects that she did during the war were having to do with the home front. The incredible effort for industrialization to build planes and ships for the war effort. In this case, the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, a little town north of Oakland, where she and Ansel Adams actually went in to photograph for Fortune magazine this incredible thing that was happening where workers going around the clock were turning out warships at an incredible rate, about a ship a week they got out. It's called the second gold rush in California because so many thousands of workers were pouring into California. Many of them were Okies and Arkies who had come to California looking for farm work. Many of them were African Americans escaping the Deep South. As she put it, sorry. Pardon me. These were the defense years, war years, shipyard years. There was overtime and swing shifts and graveyard shift, and everyone in the family worked, and the migratory workers settled down and slept under a roof, and the Negroes kept coming in droves, leaving the cotton fields of the South, and everyone was welcome. It was an integrated workforce, which was fascinating in itself. Typically powerful approach to telling a story, but also the dark side, the flip side, the non-positive side, even though it was expressed as part of the war effort and people having to come together to fight the Axis powers, was the relocation and imprisonment of more than 100,000 Americans of Japanese descent. She was hired by the War Department. The War Relocation Authority was the agency given the task of rounding up these thousands and thousands of Japanese American citizens, mostly of whom lived on the West Coast, sending them to removing all their belongings from their homes, sending them to, if they had businesses, they had to close them. This is a Japanese American businessman in Oakland who just a few days after Pearl Harbor put this sign up. She documented the whole process of processing these people and getting them ready, sending them to the relocation camps where they were housed in some cases in horse stalls. This was Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. And because she lived in the Bay Area and because her husband worked at the University of California where there were a great many Japanese American students and Japanese American faculty as well, she knew a lot of these people personally. And she and Paul were violently opposed to the process. And the government really had wanted to hire her. I guess they knew that she had worked for the government before and was a reliable, good photographer, but she did not end up producing the kind of work which was justification for the policy that they had hoped. This is a wonderful photograph taken at an elementary school in San Francisco 2 weeks before a number of these students were evacuated and sent away, and another example of how she cropped the image to get more powerful. I'm aware that I'm getting a little late on time, but there's a couple of, it's interesting fact that it really took an emotional toll on her, this project. It's the only time in her career where she sort of suffered a nervous breakdown
Her friend Christina Gardner, who worked as her assistant, said Dorothea was in a paroxysm of fear one night. She realized this was such an erosion of civil liberties. She'd gotten so consumed by it and realized the import of it so heartily that it was something that I cannot explain to this day. I've never seen her that way before or since. I never saw somebody that was in such a state. But again, she really knew these people. I love this story that she told about a young Japanese-American student, she said, named Dave Tatsumo, a very prominent and popular young man, she said, still is. He was a graduate of UC, one of these enthusiastic and loyal alumni. He'll never get over the experience that he had. During this period, I was out on the street with him. He was taking me somewhere, and we met an old high school teacher of his. He greeted her, and they stood and spoke, and I remember seeing this look go over her face. And she said, "Oh, not you, Dave. They don't mean you, Dave." She didn't realize that he was going too. To that degree, people lost their heads entirely. I think of that "not you, Dave" many times. And we've discovered in the archive letters like the one from Wasago Shibaga to Dorothea Lange saying, "We have watched with great appreciation your efforts in our behalf. It is always gratifying to realize that what you are risking for the interests of a minority group. It makes the battle of winning our rightful places in society so much easier. Please know how endlessly grateful we are." She even took the step of basically directly subverting the government's policy by contributing to this pamphlet that you see on the left called Outcasts, which is an argument against the internment. So, again, she didn't author it, she didn't have her name associated with it, but she contributed her images to it. After the war, she experienced a series of illnesses. She was tied to home more. Government jobs had dried up. She decided to turn her attention to the changing people and landscape of California, something that she saw as emblematic of the nation as a whole. The work she produced in this period became a sort of a visual critique of society as a whole, the politics of seeing. She said, "In the past, events have always played a major role in the work I've done. First there was the Depression, then the Dust Bowl, then the war. All of these were big, harsh, powerful things, and it was related to them that I tried to photograph people. Now I'm trying to get at something else. Instead of photographing men in relation to events, today I'm trying to probe the exchanges and communications between people to discover what they mean to each other and to themselves. Almost all of them are very subdued and subtle, things you have to look very hard to see because they have been taken for granted, not only by our eyes, but often by our hearts as well." So in this series of photographs, urbanization, things that were happening in the cities becoming more segregated, the difference, income inequality was something that fascinated her, affluence and poverty, always the walking wounded, which is actually the title of the photograph on the right. But then also a sort of early environmental photography. She was fascinated by things like the spread of the sprawling interstate highway system and housing tracts that were happening in California at the time, dealing with prosperity rather than depression. The automobile everywhere, houses going up at really a startling and incredible rate. The war brought incredible prosperity to California, ended the Depression, as I mentioned. Suburbs sprouting up across the country. She said, "We have in my lifetime changed from rural to urban. In my lifetime, that little space, this tremendous thing has happened." And then most notably in a project she called Death of a Valley, where she collaborated with a young photographer named Perkle Jones to record the removal of an entire town in the Berryessa Valley north of San Francisco, a town that had been there since the middle of the 19th century but needed to be removed when it was decided the valley needed to be flooded in order to make a reservoir to provide water for the Bay Area. So she went in with Perkle Jones and documented the process of tearing down the houses, bulldozing the general store, digging up the graves and moving them to higher ground, chopping down the trees and burning them. It was published as a small book by Aperture magazine. Again, environmental photography is something that has become very common, but she was a real pioneer in. And then one of her most important late projects, The Public Defender. This was something that was proposed to Life magazine and was accepted, and was to have been a photo essay in Life magazine. It ended up actually getting cut. They didn't publish it. It was published in a much abbreviated fashion in Parade, the Sunday supplement magazine. It wasn't cut for any, we're not sure why exactly. It was probably another breaking news story just happened to interrupt it, and so that was a common thing with Life magazine. If you're my age or older, you may remember how important Life magazine was. What an incredible thing. I used to, as a kid, look forward to it every week, seeing the world through pictures. Anyway, she basically set herself the task. She came up with this idea on her own, wrote up a proposal that she was going to shadow this young public defender in the Alameda County Public Defender's Office. The man you see here standing, his name was Martin Pulich, later became a much beloved judge in Alameda County. And so she hung out at the Alameda County Courthouse in Oakland and followed the entire process of booking. She photographed the defendants, people arriving in paddy wagons, going into the cells, witnesses, the judge, really the jury, incredible access. As she said, the defender is not a defender by anything but choice. It would have been easy for him to make a lot more money with a lot less effort in private practice, but he decided instead to stay where and what he is, holding fast to the belief that just as a man is to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, so a man is not to be abandoned until proven lost. Again, very timely. And I love this example here. One of the most, towards the end of her life, she began doing really extreme cropping, and she loved to zoom in on people's eyes. This is Martin Pulich, the public defender there. Really want to get in quickly something that to give an idea that we couldn't, when we, the hardest part of putting this exhibition together was taking a career that lasted from 1918 until she passed away in 1965, and those 40,000 negatives and 6,000 prints, and winnowing it down to something coherent and comprehensive, and that highlighted what we thought people would respond to as the most important aspect of her career, meant that we had to ignore a lot of things. Like, for instance, this wonderful photograph she did for a Life magazine essay on the Irish countryman. She went to Ireland in the early 1950s and did this fabulous, really touching photo essay of rural Irish life. Another important essay was called Three Mormon Towns, that also appeared in Life magazine, working as this was a collaboration with Ansel Adams, or rather it was to have been a collaboration with Ansel Adams. But even though they were close friends, they had a very prickly sort of love-hate relationship. They disagreed completely over the direction that the project was taken, and Ansel ended up taking his cameras and going home, so that what appeared in Life magazine is all Dorothea. You see the very common approach that she took to recording details, parts of people's bodies, hands, feet, legs. She often shot people from the back. She found that posture was could be just as expressive as a face, expressive of personality. So, and then finally a series of trips she took overseas with Paul, when Paul was employed by the State Department as an agricultural advisor to a lot of what they then used to call underdeveloped countries. Like went to Thailand, Egypt, Vietnam, South America, Ethiopia, all over. And again, a body of work that has not received the attention that I think it deserves. So, the question remains, artist or activist? Oh, real quickly, I want to talk about, just real briefly, the influence that she has had on whole generations of documentary photographers since then. These are works that we showed when the exhibition was in Oakland. We showed 3 contemporary photographers doing similar work. Jason Jacks, who talks about immigration and the border and how it affects people. In the middle there, Ken Light, who's done series of farm labor in the Central Valley today, obviously reminiscent of Migrant Mother, and he knew he was doing that when he was doing it. And then Janet Delaney, who's documenting the impact of gentrification in San Francisco. which ties in really interestingly with her New California series. Oh, and then one of the things I was very happy to see that the Frist has been the first venue for the exhibition to do some of the interactive that we did for the exhibition that have to do with activism and technique. When I say activism, how to make a photograph more persuasive, more effective, more emotionally powerful by things like sequencing and grouping or by cropping. We've already talked a little bit about cropping. She said, as far as sequencing, you can go in the gallery and you can actually line photographs up as Dorothea did in her studio in Berkeley, and then apply little quotations to them that help sort of explain the story. She said, I used to think in terms of individual photographs, no more. Now I think in groups of photographs. Kind of an interesting transition she had there. So finally, this is one of my favorite portraits of Dorothea, and it's by her friend Ansel Adams, who visited her. This is literally weeks before she died. She said, and Ansel said, I went over to see her. She didn't look well, but she was still marvelous and sparkling and talking. Her gestures were incredible. The older she got, the more beautiful she got. Artist or activist? I think, as I said, she's very contradictory opinions about that. When asked about it in interviews, she would usually bristle. At one point she said, I'm surprised at you to ask me such a question. That a documentarian has to be very punctilious, it has to be very careful. I'm only trying to reveal what's there for people to see. Of course, we're a lot more sophisticated now than we were in those days about what constitutes photographic truth and how even a straight documentary photograph can be altered and changed in order to affect the way that people receive it. So she would say things like that and deny having any activist intent. At the other time, but then again, she would say things like, everything is propaganda for what you believe in. It actually, isn't it? Yes, it is. I don't see that it could be otherwise. The harder and the more deeply you believe in anything, the more, in a sense, you're a propagandist. Conviction, propaganda, faith, I don't know. I've never been able to come to the conclusion that that's a bad word. Was she an artist? Was she an activist? A documentarian? A reformer? I think the answer is a resounding yes. She was all of those things, but she was also a person that refused to be pinned down. She was not, as I mentioned before, she was not a member of any political party, but she was dedicated above all to the power of seeing. She was motivated by an overwhelming interest in people, a desire to reveal their circumstances visually. That's the politics of seeing. She said one should really use the camera as though tomorrow you'd be stricken blind. To live a visual life is an enormous undertaking. I have only touched it, just touched it. During her long career, Dorothea Lange's belief in the transformative and motivating power of seeing guided her work. But she wanted to do it visually. She wanted to do it in a non-polemical kind of way. She was certain, she had faith that seeing the effects of injustice could provoke reform and just maybe change the world. Her photographs are more than simply beautiful, and they are certainly that. They're charged with a quiet outrage. They speak of a deep empathy for people, encouraging us to imagine ourselves in such a situation, that we could in different circumstances, we could very easily be them. Beauty, well, that was really secondary to Lange. One of my favorite quotes of hers is when she said, "The good photograph is not the object," she said. "The consequences of the photograph are the object." Lange wanted her audience to see and be affected by the truth of a photograph rather than its artistry, but at the same time she produced. To me, she's the perfect balance of empathy, of truth-telling, of just enough aesthetic quality so that it's not over-aestheticized. So have I answered the question? I think it's like Lange herself, a difficult one, but I hope I've given you all some background to help you think about it for yourselves. Thanks a lot. I'm told we do have a few minutes for questions if anybody has some. Yes, I once met someone who claimed to have some color photographs by Dorothea Lange, but they didn't look like Lange's. Yes. I'm sorry? Well, that was, at least in the 30s and 40s and most of the 50s, that's basically what everybody was doing. I mean, there was no alternative, and she had enough trouble getting sufficient supplies from the government to do the job that she needed to do, even, let alone the added expense of color photography. But I'm sure she thought, as most photographers of her generation, and many do now, that black and white was simply more expressive and pared down and essential. Yeah.
Thank you, and I just wonder if you could talk for a moment on, and I went through it very briefly to get down here on time too, but like the pictures upstairs, they talked about when she had her pictures impounded. How
Right.
how did those pictures come out? Like, how did you get them back?
That's a really good question. Because you do see that. There's even a book in the store here called Impounded, and it's about her photographs of the internment. And it's the government jargon for censored, basically. They didn't want them to get out. They did not fit, as I mentioned, they did not fit the government's image that they wanted to put out about what was happening. I think that has been overstated. You'll read every once in a while that her photographs of the internment were censored for 30 years, and it's not really the case. They just went into the government archive, and really, for a long time, nobody looked at them. Nobody really seemed to want to remember that episode in history, but they would have been available had you asked for them. It wasn't until the 1970s when some of the children of the internees started wanting to tell that story that those photographs came out. What else? Yeah.
So, I guess a two-part question. One's a question about the image, and another's just a technical question. On the Migrant Mother, this is question one, I've heard controversy over the years that perhaps she had that posed to some degree, that wasn't as candid as it might appear. That's my image question. My technical question is, was she like Adams, where she was the master of the darkroom, and she had to print her own images, and they always had to be to her specs and that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's no evidence that she posed the Migrant Mother photo. I've never heard anything convincing, and it doesn't actually go along with the story that she was uncharacteristically got in and got out very quickly. She didn't really spend the time. I mean, if she was working with someone, then maybe she could have coached them a little. So I don't think there's any reason to think that it's posed. Compositional perfection would certainly lead you to maybe think that, but sometimes happy accidents happen. As far as their technical, no, Ansel Adams, they were night and day. As in so many things, they were night and day. He was, almost fetishistic about a darkroom technique, and Lange, he was frankly critical of her technique in that regard. Also, she was not, the circumstances didn't allow it. She had to send, the FSA wanted her to send undeveloped rolls of film to Washington, and she said, this is crazy, I can't, how can I even know if I'm doing a good job if I don't see so she did convince them to develop, at least in California, and when she couldn't do it, she called on Ansel. Ansel developed a lot of her negatives, as a matter of fact. But the difference between an Ansel Adams, very carefully crafted Ansel Adams print, and one of Dorothea Lange's, it's really night and day. That was not what she was about. Yeah.
I'm curious about the look of the photographs in the exhibit. The newer prints, the photographs, look very different from the ones that were printed at the time. And I'm curious how much of the look of the older photographs is due to aging and how much was intentional. And if it was intentional when the newer prints are made, why there's no attempt to kind of match that particular look.
Yeah, sometimes you're looking at the effect of age. There's no question about it, particularly the ones that have, they acquire sort of a warm tone that's not present in modern prints. You know, somebody who has experience dealing with vintage prints and have seen a lot can just usually pick the modern print from the vintage one right away. Because Lange is, you know, because of that difference we were talking about with Ansel Adams or other photographers like Edward Weston, where the print was all important and the thought of letting somebody else make the print was, you know, just travesty, it was a heresy. She was not that kind of photographer, never had been that kind of photographer. That's one of the reasons we continue to make prints from her negatives, whereas it just simply wouldn't be appropriate with someone like Adams. So, yeah, oh, and as far as attempting to duplicate the appearance of the vintage prints, I personally would consider that a little dishonest. We want people to recognize that this is a print made in the 1930s and this is a print that the museum had made. We really want that to be clear. And in fact, in Oakland, one of the differences in here is that we didn't even frame the modern prints. We just presented them as wall panels, sometimes quite large, next to the framed vintage prints, so it was immediately apparent which was which. Thanks again. It was nice.